Thanks very much, Jenny and Danny and Megan and Susan and all of your personalities. Much appreciated. So as you've heard today, a significant part of our work in the Strengthening Hospital Response to Family Violence initiative is all about changing the culture of our organisations, our communities, the way in which sometimes we all think. So really, the model is all about a change management framework, and it helps step out, like the 6-step model of sensitive practice, how to make that change and change a bit of the culture in the organisation. At Bendigo Health, we've learnt that effective communication, change management is critical to the success of the change and implementation. So to speak about communication challenges when preparing and adapting to change in health services, it's now my great pleasure to introduce Jayne Dullard, former Executive Director of Communications at the Royal Children's Hospital. So please join me in welcoming Jayne.
Good afternoon, everyone. Is that on? No. I practiced this. There we go. Communication is so important inside organisations. You think about the way that information is shared across a workforce, between a workforce and constituents outside an organisation. It defines to a large extent our working experience, how well we know what we need to do, how well we understand what others around us are doing, and often just why we're there. So communication on a day-to-day basis is critical, but particularly so when something is changing, because the way that we talk to each other through a change process gives us a big picture, and it can make us tolerant or not of the things we have to put up with as things around us change, and can remind us once again of why we're doing it. Because communication is such an important part of this incredibly important work that you're doing being successful, I wanted to run you through what's in fact 2 case studies from the time that I worked at the Royal Children's Hospital to demonstrate what I think is an absolutely critical component of any communication, but particularly change communication, and something that for all sorts of reasons is almost always absent from the way that organisations circle information within their 4 walls and beyond. So if you think back to 2012, the Children's had just moved to a stunningly beautiful new building after a long build period. And for a long period of time after that, it was in the news for all the wrong reasons. This is just a very, very small selection of some of the articles that were published, particularly between about April and September of that year. I was employed essentially to try and stop these media leaks. That was what I was had a reputation for doing. But of course, it had nothing to do with media management, and it had everything to do with finding out what was irking people inside the business. Each of these stories is from an unnamed doctor or doctors, and in one case a nurse, and they went on and on and on, and they were devastating. When I got to the hospital towards the tail end of that year, I noticed pretty quickly that a feeling of grievance and resentment was pretty palpable in some areas of the workforce. I reflected on the way that change management had been undertaken, and it was apparently textbook. Staff were involved in complex consultative processes around design, how the move would be managed and how it would be done. And on the day itself, when the last sort of critically ill babies and children were moved, again, absolute textbook. They got there sooner than they thought they would. It was an absolute roaring success. And yet, these headlines persisted. As I spoke to lots of people around the organisation, I began to form the view that there was a conversation that lots of individuals, and they were in particular medical workforce, had wanted to have. And through the enormous amounts of information distributed through the hospital's intranet, on posters, in meetings, there was a kind of a conversation that was not enabled. The stuff that was happening over here and over here was not making it out somehow into the mainstream. And I formed the view that those conversations were the conversations that were critical in the sense of being making criticisms of the process. A lot of people wanted to spend more time grieving a building in which they had learnt to care for sick kids for the first time, to pay homage to that, dank rabbit warren of a place. To share their exasperations about new models of care, and to be more honest about what they thought was going to happen when they moved, without being made to feel like their commentary was obstructive or trivial or narcissistic. This was a problem for the culture of the Royal Children's Hospital, and it wasn't very long before measures of hospital performance began to show up that the workforce was not singing as one. Measures like elective surgery waiting lists, average length of stay, all of these things began to pretty much fall off a cliff. I think my executive colleagues would think that was a reasonable way of describing it. So we set about trying to disrupt what was a fairly entrenched cynicism in parts of the workforce. So first of all, we took all the really vanilla content out of the main channels that the hospital used to talk to staff. We tried to find out what the conversations were that staff were having at work every day, and to mirror or endorse or demonstrate, and sometimes even to resolve some of those conversations in mainstream channels. It meant a lot of courage from the leaders of the hospital, in particular the CEO at that time. And the catch cry that we developed to talk about how we would talk about things was warts and all. It meant that if there was a problem, that the problem would be talked about publicly, so to speak, and straight away. And that we wouldn't wait until someone had found a solution before we started to tell the workforce that the problem existed. As you can imagine, that's a tough gig for any leadership team. Over a longer period of time, I began to think about this framework for governing communications practice as news culture. It draws on my experience as a journalist many years ago now, and it recognises a couple of really sort of key facts. The first thing, and this is important in any kind of change work, is that you can never tell your audience what to talk about. You can never tell them what to talk about. But if you play your cards right and you earn their trust, then you may be able to be part of that conversation. And once you're part of that conversation, then you can influence how it travels and tracks and what its outcomes are. The golden rule of news culture is that you're always the first to break your own bad news. Funnily enough, once we started working in this way, we found that, well, not only did those early media leaks disappear quite quickly, because when we were quite frankly talking about our own shortcomings, they suddenly lost their power. And through a number of issues and crises at the Children's over the years that I was there, we followed this framework and found that there wasn't really very much left for the media to do, just as there wasn't very much left for critics inside the organisation to do. If they did need to have those conversations, they could do it safely and in a mainstream way. And over time, as we did this more and more, we realised that the three pillars of news culture, and these are pillars that pertain to content, because content is everything, were timeliness, relevance, and credibility. So timeliness means, as I said, that when something is happening, that's when you tell everybody about it. You can't wait until you've fixed it. And that's a really hard thing for managers to do, but it's essential. Relevance doesn't mean that it's relevant to me or to the person delivering a program. It means it's relevant to the members of the audience who need to hear that information and during a change to act on it. And credibility. We stopped writing articles on our intranet news page that said things like, all staff are reminded to 5S their desks. Instead, we would say that, and we would name someone. Deputy CEO John Stanway has reminded all senior medical staff that they need to, whatever it was. Everything that was sent out as a directive or a request was owned by somebody, so that everyone could see who had their bum on the line if things went wrong, but also knew who to go to if they needed some help. Things started to turn around, I thought, surprisingly quickly. We saw lots of green shoots of change all over the place. As I said, those media leaks dried up. We had a number of crises that we dealt with really effectively as a community inside the hospital without them leaking out to the media. And over time, as we started to shift our communications focus to work being done by clinical teams and redesign work, we saw those indicators of a poor culture, which are poor performance, start to subside and eventually reverse. I don't want to sound like I'm sugarcoating or gilding the lily. In any kind of case study, we have to streamline the reality that we share. And of course, there are people who were unhappy and would have been unhappy whatever happened. But this was pretty significant and was recognised around the hospital that things had changed. A couple of years later, we had the chance to really test this framework when it was announced that the Children's would implement an electronic medical record. It was the first time that this particular EMR had been used in Australia. It was created by an American company called Epic. So a lot of change to the platform itself would have to be undertaken. There was a lot of money at stake. It was about $50 million. And as you all know, state governments are a little politically sensitive to big IT projects, particularly in the health space. So for all sorts of reasons, we needed to have everyone working towards the same goal. We used our very small EMR communications budget to employ someone who would just write great copy. She lived with the EMR team. Her name was Emma Mellon, and she works here at Peter Mac now. She's an absolute, I was going to say genius, she might resent that. She's certainly a very, very good operator. She made sure that any problems that were coming up that the project team was hearing about as they worked their way through craft groups and around the wards would come to us really quickly. So before a negative conversation could even get too much rubber on the road, we were onto it and we were publishing it, and we were using the same language that staff were using to talk about those problems. This is a little list of the things that we did throughout our campaign to keep our staff engaged, first of all, and then with clear instruction about what they needed to do and when. The training component of that project in particular was huge, and as you know, getting staff away from the wards and other areas of a hospital to attend training ain't easy at any point in time. Regular Q&A forums were an essential part of this project, and they're really important in any change process when you're communicating change to stakeholders, because people need a safe space where they can ask really dumb questions. You know, I have trouble when Windows gets updated, and I was very aware of the fact that a lot of staff, particularly older nursing staff who don't have high computer literacy, were nervous about the fact that they were having to work with an IT system after, well, in our case, 140 years of writing it all down on paper. So we would, when we felt that a particular group of people was getting a bit antsy, we would start holding a Q&A forum that spoke directly to them. We spent money on catering, whatever money we could scrounge. I am well known by cupcake providers around Melbourne. Coffee and muffin and a well-timed forum with the people who are making the decisions, openly and transparently answering any questions that come to them, absolutely critical. We'd then pick up on all that content, we'd publish it in subscriber newsletters so that everyone knew the stuff that we knew people were talking about. And through all of that, we adhered very carefully to news culture. Here's just a couple of the, I think, hundreds of stories that Emma wrote over the course of the project. And you'll see, you know, not really pulling too many punches. Pass your EMR proficiency or no EMR access is possibly one of her more pointed articles. Cardiac surgeons, the first surgical team to come. Could you imagine what the other surgeons did when they saw that? Oh, bloody hell. I'm going to get in there and do my training as well, like Christian Brazard. Once we got to Go Live, and that article from Saturday the 30th of April was the day of Go Live, we published the top 10 issues every single day for 4 weeks. And some of them were, you know, they were quite a revelation, quite a concession of defeat on minor issues. But people knew that they could trust the team managing the project, that they could trust what we were telling them was working and what wasn't. So the things that we achieved, that we had set out to achieve, were no media leaks. We got 30 out of 52 project team roles filled by RCH staff. We got 98% competency in the system. We'd been aiming for 80, and the project went live on time, on budget, and with 0 critical incidents. And I've pointed out there a couple of other things that happened that we didn't exactly anticipate, but they spoke to the coherence of the communications approach. Now, the incredibly robust and high-quality framework that you are working with in the response is points out that you will need a communications strategy and a communications plan in order to achieve success. Most of you will have communication teams in your health service that can do that work for you. They will be very harried, overworked, strung out, and probably, I'll leave it there, people. If you can work with them and help them, that would be a good outcome for everybody. So the first thing I wanted to say very, very quickly was, do not Google communication strategy. Everything that turns up will be absolute rubbish. Instead, think about these things. I would have these headings in a communication strategy. Remember, this is big picture. Don't make it more than 2 pages. You don't need to write about the project. It needs to be read. You need your principles in there, and I would suggest something like, in order to ensure staff come with us through the project, we adhere to timely reporting of project challenges and weaknesses to build staff confidence, something like that. Because once that's been signed off, when an executive director says to you down the track, you can't tell them that, you can't tell them that, you say, yes, we can, remember? We said that we would. Your objectives, and they need to be clinical and operational objectives, not communications objectives. We don't want to talk about reach and likes and numbers of posters printed. You need to identify the audiences that you're speaking to because they are all different. We all know they're all different, so write it down and work out how you're going to address each of them. Key messages are important too, and approvals processes. You don't want timely information being held up as information makes its way slowly through the upper echelons of your health service hierarchy. You need to commit on a bit of paper at the outset to the fact that that will happen really quickly. I would argue that the senior person in your health service for communications responsibility needs to wear that one. Communications plan is the day-to-day what we're going to do. It's the what, when, how and to whom. I won't go through this list in too much detail, except to say you should always think from the end first. What do we need everyone to do? Well, you know you need them to attend training. You know you need them to speak in a particular way. You know you need them to identify certain characteristics of patients presenting to them. So work backwards from there. How do we get to each of those groups of people? How do they need that information packaged, and how do we put it somewhere that they can always get back to it really easily? Communications plan gets updated all the time, so don't get too hung up on needing to change it. That's a good thing. And really, really importantly, a study that was done in Illinois in the States in the very, very late 1990s, I like old school research, showed that during change projects, organisations tended to really load up with, inspiring key messages of organisational intent and purpose and why we're all here. Sure, you need a little bit of that because it provides context, but when I say a little bit, I mean about 10%. About 50% of the content you share during a change process needs to give people the information that they need to do something differently. So schedules around training, very, very important. Language that should be used, scripts that can be used in dealing with patients, very, very important. About 50% of your content needs to focus on that really hardcore, enabling transactional stuff. And I guess finally, don't feel compelled to reinvent the wheel. You don't need a new website because you're doing a new project. Posters on the back of toilet doors work really, really well. So be real about how much new stuff you can or should create for a change project. The places that people go to get information is the right place to place the information. And use people inside your organisation who are influencers, because other staff will listen to and follow them. Now, I'm be very happy to have a chat to you if you're stuck with any of these things, or if any of your colleagues are, not to actually write communication strategies for you for NICS. I'm sorry I can't do that, but do feel free to reach out if you need a bit of a heads up. And I have been really struck by just the quality of this project. My hats off to all of you who have been involved in it and leading it so far, and to the rest of you as you carry that amazingly important work forward. Thank you and good luck.
Thank you very much, Jane. Have we got time? I can't set the clock for a couple of questions before you leave the floor. I'm sure there may be. Oh.
It's not so much a question as a comment, but I was... not more of a comment. I was at the Children's through the EMR process, and I think one of the things that really helped, particularly with those low calls to the helpline, was that there were champions embedded everywhere, and they're still there and they're still being used, and it's still a continual process, that they were very much supported and educated a step ahead of everyone else, and then we had local faces that we knew that we could just bounce up to very casually and have a chit chat.
And they wore bright green vests. So
they wore bright green vests.
An idea I'm going to take on board, seeing as though we're about to go through this process. Is there any other questions? No? I think they might catch you at the break, Jane, if that's all right. So thank you very much to all the speakers from that session. It's been very powerful and very motivating, and I think we've taken a lot away from these sessions this afternoon. Just before we do break for afternoon tea, just to, I should have said this at the start, but Georgina Galbraith from Social Work at the Women's is available to support anyone wanting to chat about their own personal experience. Tanya from this morning's left, but Georgina is around if anyone would like to have a chat to her. So now I'd like to invite you to join us for afternoon tea out in the atrium, and then we'll return for our final session at 3 o'clock on how to support our workforce.